This video covers topic 7.12 of the APUS History course and exam description, mobilization during World War II, the home front. When you think about mobilization during a wartime national crisis, imagine it's like a machine with three gears. The gears are your government, your business, and your people. Notice that your people are going to be the biggest part of this, just due to sheer numbers, okay? Let's see how the US government mobilized successfully to help win World War II. So gear number one is the actions of the government, the federal government we're going to look at. So before the start of the war, really, the government created special agencies to help manage mobilizations, and some of those were the Wartime Production Board, the Office of War Mobilization, and the Office of Price Administration. And these three agencies, they manage the industries, they control the raw materials, they manage production priorities, they told business what to produce, how much to produce. They froze people's wages. They froze prices on goods, rents. They managed the rationing of commodities, and they did this to protect against the inflation that would have resulted from the mass purchase, hoarding. So these federal agencies were put in place to help stop that too. When you think about federal spending during World War II, it increased 1,000%, which if you think about the deficit spending during the Great Depression, New Deal, this is basically deficit spending on steroids, and it's going to show that the US government was able to essentially spend their way out of a depression due to their mobilization during World War II. Now, what did business and industry do, the second part of the machine? The US industry will indeed boom during World War II, just through sheer production. And to give you an idea of the numbers, the US industrial output was double of all of the Axis powers combined. So that's Japan, that's Germany, that's Italy. The US produced twice as many as all of these three governments in line. So the US industry really mobilized and produced a lot of goods in quite a short amount of time. The big companies that we see would be Ford Motor, Chrysler, and General Motors, automobile companies. And I put the date of development, or at least the start date of development on there, because notice that the US didn't enter the war until 1942. However, Ford with its Jeep, Chrysler building M4 Sherman tanks, development started 1940. So that's how this mobilization was able to be so successful. These companies and the federal government combined had the foresight to prepare. And Ford Motors specifically is going to help develop the general purpose vehicle, later on called the Jeep, which is kind of the great grandfather to the SUVs that many of us drive now. Chrysler developed and built M4 Sherman tanks. General Motors retrofitted their Cadillac factory to make tanks. And the automobile retrofitted their factories to make munitions. So they were able to get started a little over a year before U.S. entry in the war in order to have time to retrofit those factories and set them up so that they can make munitions and tanks and Jeeps. We should also remember Henry Kaiser, who owned shipyards on the West Coast. And Kaiser Shipyard in California could construct a new ship every 14 days and did that. So the scale of production produced by these industries was massive. But again, you can't have this kind of production without the last part, the last gear in this whole machine, which is your people. So every group in the United States adjusted to wartime measures: men, women, minorities, children. People are going to move from rural areas to the West Coast, to the Midwest, in order to pursue factory work, industrial work in defense industries. New defense installations will be installed in the South, and this will encourage more Americans to migrate there, and this will eventually become the Sun Belt that becomes very popular in the 1950s. Now, looking at other demographic groups, specifically African Americans, over 1 million served in the military, and 1.5 million participated in the Second Great Migration and left the South to work in the North and West and work in factory jobs, in defense industries, and earn more money than they would have if they just stayed in their communities in the South. And then this had an effect on debates over racial segregation and discrimination. Membership in the NAACP increased. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, was formed. You're also going to have an important executive order, 8802, that prohibited racial discrimination in government and businesses that received federal contracts. There was also an important Supreme Court case from 1944, Smith v. Albright, which ruled the white primaries in Texas, the Democratic white primaries, unconstitutional, citing the 14th Amendment, right to equal protection under the law, as a reasoning rationale for ruling the white primaries in Texas unconstitutional. Again, kind of using the 14th Amendment, a lot like it would be in Brown versus Board of Education. And also the 14th Amendment, which was used in Plessy v. Ferguson, but interpreted differently to account for racial segregation. So again, looking at this, the Supreme Court changes over time with its membership, with what's acceptable in society. So we're seeing more of a push for equality. What about women? So women certainly mobilized to participate in the war effort. Over 200,000 will serve in the military, and they will be relegated to non-combat roles, but they will take the place of men in clerical posts. They'll serve as test pilots, where they'll test out aircraft that was constructed in the United States and fly it to California to go to the Pacific Front. They worked as nurses, as doctors, as drivers, in order to divert more of those male workers to combat roles. Commanders were initially resistant. However, as time went on, as the war went on, they do see and become appreciative of women, the women's roles in these, and we'll wind up requesting more, but particularly Eisenhower and Marshall were supportive of women. Eisenhower will go on to appoint the first female Army officer ever in the U.S. military a couple of years after the war ends. In the workforce, you'll have over 5 million women entering to work in defense industries and shipyards. And this was a concerted effort by the government to entice women with the posters of Rosie the Riveter, all of the pictures. They even released a Rosie the Riveter song. Click that link to listen to it and to jam out to a little bit of Rosie the Riveter. What was their pay like? They received lower pay than their male counterparts. Married women will also be working, and there'll be a push to encourage more married women with propaganda, enticing them to support their husbands on the European and Pacific fronts by working in defense industries. And in addition to working outside the home, they'll have to manage their households too without their husbands. They'll have to learn how to do like home repairs, fixing the car, rationing goods. They'll take over mechanical tasks at the home and really pick up a lot of the slack that was left when the men went to fight in the war. And about Japanese Americans, we went over this on other video. Japanese Americans will be targeted due to war hysteria following the attack on Pearl Harbor, which will lead to Executive Order 9066, which was signed by Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president, which forced Japanese Americans living on the West Coast to live in internment camps, military barracks away from the West Coast. This order only applied to Japanese Americans that lived on the West Coast of the United States. If they lived in the South, in the East, in the Midwest, they were excluded from this. However, though, many Japanese Americans will be unfairly imprisoned in these barracks for the duration of the war. Important Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus the United States, questions the constitutionality of the executive order, and the Supreme Court upheld the order, arguing that this was a justified condition in times of war. Uh, in 1988, the US government did formally apologize for the internment, claiming it was racist and these people were targeted due to war hysteria, and paid reparations for those that were still alive after the fact. Mexicans and Mexican Americans also contributed to the war effort. Over 300,000 served in the military. Many also worked in the West Coast in the Bracero program, which was a way for the United States government to make up for farm labor shortfalls during harvest season. And these braceros were allowed to enter the country to work from Mexico without going through formal immigration proceedings. But the rationale was that this was a temporary migration, and then once the war was over, once harvest season was over, these braceros would return to Mexico. There was resistance from both countries due to a labor shortage in Mexico. The Mexican government did not want all of these workers leaving to work in the United States, where they would earn higher wages than they got in Mexico. On the United States end of things, there was, of course, racism, fear of job competition. Again, when you think about immigration, the native, quote unquote, Americans will be fearful, concerned, and in some cases hostile to the new groups coming in. And fear of job competition, housing competition is a big part of that. And again, this fear and uncertainty led to resentment by whites, especially in Los Angeles. And I give you the Zoot Suit riots as your example for that. Later on, after the war ends, the U.S. government organized a mass deportation effort in 1953, particularly targeting undocumented Mexicans, many of which entered the United States during World War II in order to work and just did not leave. So it was kind of a contradictory message. Come up here and work without any formal immigration proceedings, that's fine. But then 1953, get out, we don't want you anymore. Nice one, US government, nice and tactful. So to close up, I thought it might be a good idea to discuss some of the current day situation, because many people on the news, many historians are claiming, and I think rightly so, that the current mobilization to fight the coronavirus is similar to a wartime mobilization. So remember your 3 gears of successful mobilization: your government, your business, and your people. So what has the government been doing? The government reauthorized the Defense Production Act of 1950, which did a lot of the same things that the World War II mobilization industries did. However, the current reauthorization of it seems to just stick to direction of private industry. We're not seeing much with like price controls, rent controls yet. That's being handled a bit by the state and local governments and the state governors. The Food and Drug Administration granted emergency clearance to test kits as kind of a fast track to get more people tested. What have the businesses been doing? We see General Motors once again, just like we did in World War II. General Motors is going to produce ventilators as per the Defense Production Act that was reauthorized. So they're retrofitting their factories. 3M, General Electric, and Medtronic are also producing N95 masks. What about a vaccine, though? Well, Johnson & Johnson is one of the lead companies developing a vaccine, and they have promised to start clinical trials in September of this year. We'll see if that actually happens. The company LabCorp is developing at-home testing kits, which is going to be distributed to healthcare workers and first responders. And again, the FDA had a hand in granting that emergency clearance so that could get rolled out. But then what about our largest gear, our people? Individually, we have over 18 million healthcare workers in the United States, and women make up 80% of that 18 million. So again, we're seeing women really mobilize again, just like they did during World War II. We're also seeing healthcare workers that retired were asked to re-enter the workforce, and many have. Also, medical students that are nearing the end of their study or nearing the end of their residencies are being recruited to provide support. And some med schools are also offering early graduation for those students to get them into the service and help relieve some of the healthcare workers that are working currently and are overwhelmed. So I'm not going to tell you how well this is going to turn out. I think you can figure that out for yourself, but think about which wheels are turning more than others, is there any gear in that equation that's missing? Watch over the next couple of weeks and see who's picking up slack and who's not. Anyway, I hope this video finds you well. I hope this was a helpful review for you, and I will see you on the other side. Take care.